Am I on? Sounds like I'm on. Good morning. No, I do not want to install a software update right this second. Thank you. Been a week since we've had our class. We had a good meeting last week, and now we're going to dive back into 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. We finished up a week ago talking about the roles of women in the church, and I think we covered that pretty well. Lesson number 3 in our workbooks begins talking about church officers, and specifically in the beginning here about elders. And of course, we're going to talk about these qualifications for elders and deacons and go through these things. May take us a little while to do this, and to do it justice. I don't necessarily understand why the author of our workbook lumped all this into one lesson, because I think it's a lot more in depth, and maybe is better broken up into a couple lessons as far as the class goes. But we'll take as much time as we need and talk about these things in whatever amount of detail you guys want and seems appropriate. As we begin this section, this lesson, again, as we go throughout all these lessons, as we go throughout these books, I want us to understand and always think about the context here and think about the threads that kind of weave through all these discussions that Paul has with Timothy about these various topics. And as we begin, let's remember what Paul's purpose in writing to Timothy is. And we see that, I think, stated very clearly in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 14 and 15. He says, "These things I write to you, though I hope to come to you shortly. But if I am delayed, I write so that you may know how you ought to conduct yourself in the house of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and the ground of truth." And so Paul is wanting things to be set in order. He's wanting things to be done the way that God would have them done in the church, and to deal with the issues that we've talked about previously here in the Ephesian church in the way that God would have them done. And so he's working on the problems of leadership in this church. And as we read in the previous 2 lessons, the way that these problems are going to be solved are going to be for godly men to lead. And it started with prayer. It started with the leadership of men praying and leading in that way in the church. But then he transitions here to talking about elders and deacons, and we see the necessity of having qualified, godly men to lead the church. And I think any of us who have been in the church long enough understand that perhaps all too well. If you've been in churches without elders and been in churches with elders, if you've been in churches with good elders, you've been in churches with less than good elders, you begin over time to understand the importance not only of having elders, but of having qualified, godly elders and deacons. But we're going to specifically focus on elders this morning. To lead the church, and the problems that come along with not having them versus having them. So as we look at all these qualifications, it's important to understand the way that God designed the church to be, And remember, why did God design the church the way He designed it? Well, He made us. He created us. He knows us better than we know ourselves, and He knows how our behavior and how our tendencies can either lead a church to great heights or bring it down to terrible depths. And of course, I think it's important to think about too, as we know in our world today, there are lots of false teachings and false ideas about who can serve as elders and deacons, who can serve in these offices. And we see denominations, even now today, dividing and splitting over the idea of whether or not women can serve in these roles. And what these roles even mean as far as their roles within the church. And I don't think it's a coincidence that after talking about the difference in the roles of men and women in the church, he begins to talk about the qualifications of elders and deacons. I don't think that's a coincidence at all. And as we go throughout these qualifications and we look at the scriptures regarding elders, it becomes, I think, very clear that this is an office for men. And I pulled this chart straight out of your workbooks. I thought this was really well done. Looking at the three words that are used in Scripture to talk about elders. And again, Greek is not my first language, so we'll try our best here, but episkopos, presbyteros, and poimen are the three words that are used throughout the Scripture to describe. Sometimes we typically say elders, but episkopos means a bishop or an overseer. Presbyteros means a presbyter, an elder, and poimen meaning a pastor and a shepherd. And again, those are all words that get used and misused in a lot of denominations. We see the biblical example of this all being one thing, and these words being used in different contexts to denote different parts of what that office means. But the world has taken this to say, well, these are all different things, and we can create all these different offices, all these different ideas, and all these different church structures and organizations, and the world has remade the church in the image of our wisdom, right? Not God's wisdom. So many church denominations today have organized their structure to be more like a corporation. We have a board, we have a CEO, we have a president, we have different people who, all these different structures that are designed to mimic our wisdom and how to run an organization, rather than using the biblical example and using God's wisdom and how He wants His church to be designed and to be taken care of. And so these three different words and these three different meanings, when we combine them together, we see someone who is an overseer. And he included Thayer's definitions and all these things. An overseer, a man charged with the duty of seeing the things to be done by others are done rightly, a curator, a guardian, or a superintendent. And certainly elders have that duty as well, to oversee the work that is done by the church, to make sure that it is done correctly, to make sure that it is done in a way that will be pleasing to God and be beneficial to the saints that are a part of that body. And we see there in Acts chapter 20 and verse 28, he says, "Therefore take heed to yourselves and to all the flock, among which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers, to shepherd the church of God, which He purchased with His own blood." The commandment there to take heed to yourselves as overseers, that they were appointed to do that work. And that word is also used in Titus chapter 1 and verse 7. For a bishop must be blameless as a steward of God, not self-willed, not quick-tempered, not given to wine, not violent, not greedy for money. That idea of being a steward of God, one who is in charge of something, one who has a charge to care for something. And then that second word there, presbyteros, an elder. Thayer's definition there of age, advanced in life, an elder, a senior, meaning an older man, but also denoting dignity. And so we see throughout these qualifications that an elder is not someone, an overseer, a shepherd, cannot be qualified unless they've lived some life. They've experienced some life. They have the wisdom that comes with age and with experience, and the dignity that comes with having gone through the challenges and trials of life in a godly way and in a God-centered way, and the wisdom that is only gained through those trials and difficulties. And then finally there, the idea of a pastor. And I think this is perhaps the word that is most commonly misused in our world today, right? The denominational world views this as being one and the same as the preacher, the evangelist, and oftentimes in the evangelical world and in all those kinds of churches, the pastor is kind of in charge of the church. You know, they may have elders, but very often those elders are perhaps a notch below the pastor or preacher, as it were, or perhaps maybe only have the kind of the same vote that he has. But the pastor is very much in charge of those churches and is very much in charge of directing their theology, directing their worship and the way things are done. And the elders, if they even have folks that they call elders, would be there simply to serve as advisors, as a counsel, and things like that. And so we see the problems that come up with all that kind of thing, and the problems that come up needlessly because we stray from God's plan and God's purpose and pattern for the church. But the definition there of pastor or a shepherd, Thayer's definition is a herdsman, especially a shepherd. And if you've ever studied that idea of a shepherd and really looked at it, somebody did a great study on this years ago, looking at it truly from the standpoint of a shepherd, one who herds sheep, and think about the parallels there between what elders or pastors do within the church and what a shepherd does to guard his flock, to care for it, and particularly the way sheep behave and the way we as a group of people often behave. The parallels are striking, and sometimes maybe to our embarrassment. But these words are not used coincidentally. They're used very purposefully and specifically. And so as we think about all these qualifications and we think about the work that elders do, it's important to understand that these three words are describing the office and describing the type of men that should hold that office and the work that they should do in leading the Lord's church. Does anybody have any thoughts, anything interesting you found about any of these words and how they're used before we start getting into these different qualifications?
Just a question, Jonathan. Episcopos and the presbyteros, is that where the Episcopalians and
It is, and I didn't study deeply into how they use that and why and where, but that is absolutely where that comes from, and it gets into kind of their theology about church organization and structure, absolutely, and probably as the Protestant movement evolved and expanded, those are just different groups that kind of broke out into different ideas about how that should go.
Funny how it just seems like by the word's definition that they're saying they're a church of elders.
Yeah, and again, I think it relates more to how they organize and structure the church versus I don't think they would think of themselves all as that, but how they organize their church. And again, I did not delve deeply into that to give you a good answer, but.
I'd always wondered, because it was like, people bring it up,
Right. Yeah, somebody might have a better answer than me, but it definitely relates to kind of their beliefs on the structure of the church and just different groups that have kind of broken out through the years of what we would call Protestantism.
One of the things that really overwhelms me in looking at the denominational churches, they have so many committees.
Right.
They're, the head of the committee, this committee for finding a new minister, and this committee for everything.
Right. And why do you think that is? Why does the world want to have all these committees and votes and all this involvement?
Who knows?
Well, I think we know absolutely. The same reason that we love voting in elections. We love having that right. Well, yeah, we all want to have a say. We all want to feel like we're heard. We all want to feel like I used to work with a young lady who seemed like every couple of years she would kind of bounce around to a different church, always some kind of problem. And I remember we had a discussion about some of these things about church organization and that kind of thing. And the church I think she was involved in at the time voted on everything. Everything was a vote. It was an absolute democracy, and you can imagine the chaos that would be. But everything was a vote, and her, I guess, defense of that was, well, it's my money. I want to decide how it's spent. And that brings up a whole litany of problems. But yes, so we do see a lot of committees and a lot of organizations that get created by man, and that's exactly why, because we don't want to give up control. We don't want to give it to God. We don't want to give it to godly men. We don't want to surrender. We don't want to submit to His wisdom ultimately, and to an eldership or to those who might rule over us. We want to feel like we're in charge, and so I think we see the problems that come along with that. Yes, ma'am.
It's almost like they want a king,
Mm-hmm.
and it's kind of set up the way that Roman Catholic Rome,
Mm-hmm.
the way they had it set up, whether it's a diocese or
Mm-hmm.
all of that. After that, they usually get the final say so.
Right.
Then they've got the power. It's the money.
Yeah, and you can. There's some interesting things you can watch or listen to, read about some of these different mega churches and kind of how they've risen to prominence over the years. And it's very much like what you say. What did the Israelites do? God gave them a plan, and they said, well, we'd like to have a king. We'd like to be like all those around us. And I think that's very much similar to what happens in the church today, is we look around at the world around us, and we try to draw from that wisdom, and we try to draw from the appeal and the allure of, well, if we can find this one really dynamic person, and he can bring in lots of people, he can bring in lots of money, and we can have all this stuff and all this big church and all this big place. And, we might have to sacrifice a little theology here and there. We might have to sacrifice some doctrine. We might steer away from some things that are uncomfortable. But man, think how many people we'll bring to the Lord. You're right. Well, we all have.
One year, doesn't matter who it was, Church of Christ it was, but one year they wanted all of these things, have all these programs, and that's
Yeah.
denominational. I just remember a lot of them were headed by women as well. I mean, good ideas, and then come to find out the elders went to prominent denomination preachers to see how they did what they did.
Right.
Their growth. I think I was angry for a long time about that.
Yeah.
I just couldn't understand it. It's like, there's all kinds of churches of Christ, big ones, in other areas. Want to know about size and growth and all of that. Why don't you go over there?
Yeah.
Ask them. And to this day, none of that stuff has happened.
Right. Yeah. When we go to the world and seek after that wisdom rather than the wisdom of God, then we've gone down the wrong path for sure.
Remember what God told Samuel? That Israel's not rejecting you for their king. They're rejecting me.
Right. Absolutely. Anytime that we stray away from the pattern, that's exactly what we're doing.
Hey, John, last thought. I think that we probably do ourselves a disservice if we got away from using the word pastor.
Oh, absolutely.
There is a significant amount of meaning and value in that word. If we're scared of it, we are, I don't know that we fully are describing the role. That word is not part of the scripture.
Absolutely, and that's a great point, is we have absolutely allowed the world's misuse of that word to cause us to not use it. And I think we absolutely err in that. And I think we do so in a couple of ways. One is we just don't use the word, but we also fail to use the resource. We fail to seek pastoring, and we fail to foster pastors because we're so afraid of that word, and we're so afraid of someone misunderstanding what we mean by that. And that could be a whole nother class right there, just on that idea of a pastor and being pastored to is a huge part of it. And as we think about all these qualifications, all of that certainly is finding someone who can be a pastor as well as an overseer. And certainly the kind of relationship that gets into that idea of shepherding, that idea of that relationship that a shepherd has with his sheep, and the way he knows them and the way he understands them and the way that they trust in him is a huge part of that.
There's a reason all those different words are used to describe. There's not a job, there's not a specific title given to this office, right? We use
Right.
elder, but it's not a specific title. I think there's a reason all those words are used.
Absolutely.
If you find somebody that's just a superintendent, but not a shepherd,
Right.
you probably don't have the full spectrum of what is entailed there.
Right. And I also think that is another reason why, and we'll get into that here in a little bit, why the plurality of elders is so crucial. Because you're never going to find someone who is 100% all of those three things. Yes, sir.
To use a world example to illustrate, that's one title for the head of the executive branch of government.
Sure.
He's also known as Commander-in-Chief of the diplomat, traveling overseas. And main description.
Right. Yeah, there's lots involved in that as well. But the idea of an elder who can be everything to everybody all the time, we know that's not reality. And even when we talk about someone who is able to teach, and we'll get into that, does that mean that they have to be able to get up and deliver a perfect polished sermon with a shiny PowerPoint just like Kyle does? No, not necessarily. That's not everybody's forte. That's not everybody's gift. Perhaps they're better at teaching Bible class. Perhaps they're better at personal study. What we're talking about there is being able to teach, but not a specific type of teaching. And, there are going to be some elders who are better at pastoring, and better at one-on-one dealing with issues, holding hands through problems. And there are going to be some elders who are better at, organizing work that needs to be done and making decisions and things like that. And so the plurality of elders, I think, is very much a result of the fact that an eldership needs to have all three of these things, all of these qualifications. Well, they all have to have these qualifications, but those three different words, those three different parts of the office, we might say, maybe, it's kind of like when you create your character on a video game. You got so many points, you got to allocate them to different things. So, any other thoughts before we kind of start diving in here? I stopped making slides for all these things at some point because I realized we weren't going to get through them all, and now I'm not sure if we're going to get through hardly any of them. But we'll pick up with it wherever we end.
Just another thought that just come to me, thinking of the word pastor and how they're a shepherd. Not really, even in the past, I've even viewed the elders, but when you think about comparison to David, David's job was to protect the flock, oversee them. But he also would get his hands dirty and would put himself at risk. He took the bear by the beard and slew it. And he boldly walked out to confront Goliath. Nobody forced him to it. Nobody said, hey, David, go deal with this problem. He went to deal with it himself. And even though he put himself at great risk, it was his responsibility to protect the flock, to protect the people. So we don't really look at our elders like that. But that's part of their job, is to be there for us. When troubles come, they got to go boldly into that danger and deal with it.
Right.
And stand firm in their beliefs.
It's not all standing around with the hook and looking at the sheep, right? Sometimes it's real danger and real fighting. Absolutely. So somebody, as we get started here, somebody read for us 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 7.
Saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble task. Therefore, an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not a drunkard, not violent, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. He must manage his own household well, with all dignity, keeping his children submissive. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for God's church? He must not be a recent convert, or he may become puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil. Moreover, he must be well thought of by outsiders, so that he may not fall into disgrace, into a snare of the devil.
All right, now somebody read Titus chapter 1, verses 5 through 9. Titus 1, 5 through 9. All right, thank you. So, as you read through these, as you studied these, what was something that jumped out at you just right away looking at these lists, these descriptions, these qualifiers of who can be an elder? Was there anything just kind of broadly that jumped out at you? Yeah, there's really nothing in here, hardly, that isn't commanded to all of us. You know, we are all to be godly people. We are all to be temperate and sober-minded, of good behavior, hospitable, able to teach. And so the difference maybe between someone who is qualified as an overseer is someone who we really see a great example overall in all these things as a godly man living a godly life. Sam, what were you going to say?
Being a male.
Okay.
That's big outfit.
Yeah, absolutely.
And an older.
Right. And an older male. Something else that just struck me was, and especially as I was making this PowerPoint, because it's just like slide after slide after slide, there's a lot of qualifications here. There's a lot of things. And something else that I thought about as I'm looking at all this is how much they overlap in different ways. So there are lots of these different things that are similar but not the same. And one interesting argument that I came across in reading some different books and commentaries and things is there have been those who have said that the only qualification of an elder is this in verse 2 of 1 Timothy 3 is that a bishop then must be blameless. And I thought that was kind of interesting. And I read a couple things that argued that both ways. And you could certainly say that being blameless encompasses all these things, but we also don't look at this and see that this is, a list of things describing what it means to be blameless. This is a list of things that are all, I think, equal in importance. And I also think we could get into a situation where, a bit like the Pharisees maybe, about this idea of being blameless above all else. Being, not guilty of specific things above all else. So I don't ascribe to that argument, but I thought it was interesting just to understand how much these words are all interwoven together. The idea of being temperate and sober-minded and of good behavior. Those are all very similar ideas, but they denote more specific things within themselves. So there's just a lot to think about and a lot going on there. But I want to start with this first thing, and this is one that has always been interesting to me, and I've heard different people talk about this different ways. This is one of Paul's faithful sayings. He says, "This is a faithful saying. If a man desires the position of a bishop, he desires a good work." And other translations, and I think perhaps more accurately, say, if anyone aspires to the office of an overseer. He desires a noble task. So this raises, I think, an interesting question of, is desire for the office a qualification to be an elder? Carol says yes. Would anybody dispute that?
One way I would argue that somebody who doesn't want the office, for the right reasons, understands the responsibility that comes with it. That's me, I've always said I hate responsibility because I understand what comes with it. There's
Okay.
the responsibility of being in that position, and sometimes it's not desirable to put yourself out there like that.
So desire is a tricky thing. There are lots of people who desire positions of authority. There are fewer people who desire positions of authority for the correct reasons. Now, obviously, in concert with all these other qualifications, someone who desires the office would need to be someone who desires it for the right reason. But I think we also maybe need to think about what it means to desire, or again, I like this translation a little better, aspire to the office. And I also think we need to be careful in not putting words in Paul's mouth here, because it seems to me that what he's saying here is he's talking about the office. He's talking about anyone who desires this office is desiring a noble task. He's desiring something noble. And so the compliment, as it were, here is about the office as much as it might be about the man. That it is a noble task. It is a noble office, a noble work. And so I think sometimes we maybe put too much emphasis on that idea of desiring it, rather than what Paul seems to be trying to say here is that this is a noble thing to do. This is a noble thing to be a part of. And I want to give you an example. And normally I hate whataboutism, but this is not whataboutism. This is something I know that happened that is true, and I think it just gives us maybe a different way of thinking about this idea of desiring the office. So the church that I attended in Bowling Green, at one time prior to me being there, was in a situation where they were going to be without elders if someone didn't step up and be appointed. And there was a man who was qualified. The church felt like he was qualified, but it was not something that he necessarily desired to do at that point in his life. For whatever reason, and I don't know the specifics. But if he didn't, the church would be without elders. And so he made the decision to change his desire. And whatever it was, and whether it was just his work situation, or that he didn't feel like he had the time, or whatever it was, and again, I don't know the specifics, but he changed his attitude toward that to make sure that the church didn't go without elders. And if I'm not mistaken, he's still serving today, and this was a long time ago, and serving well as far as I've ever known. And so that's always given me a little different perspective about this idea of desire. And kind of to what Shane was saying, perhaps the right kind of desire, that he's not someone who is clawing at the door wanting to take that position and take on that authority, but someone who desires that the church be served, and desiring that the church not fall out of order. So again, not saying that desire is just absolutely not a qualification or it's not important, but I think sometimes we think about the idea of desire a little bit wrongly. Yes, ma'am.
As members, take away man's desire to oversee and treat. I think sometimes there are men who maybe are qualified in their
Yeah, we certainly need to be a desirable flock, we might say. But, you know, if we're not, that oftentimes means that we need strong leadership all the more because of problems that can arise there with dissension and things like that.
That's a really interesting comment. I never heard that story. That just sounds another level of evolution of Christianity in the individual. I remember the first time I was asked to do an invitation or lead a song. Absolutely did not want to do it. But you do those things to grow and to develop. And you get maybe a little bit, maybe a little more polished with it. I can get that. I can respect that story as an elder. Maybe not necessarily wanting to do it, but needing to do it for the church. And that's an added sacrifice. Amazing.
Yeah.
Of the evolution of his faith.
Yeah. Yeah, and you know, our desire is something that can change, and something, you know, none of us desired any of these things at some point in our lives. But seeing the need for men to lead and seeing the calling that, as we might say, to do that work, you know, sometimes we have to bend our will, well, all the time we have to bend our will to God's will and to the needs of others. I like the way somebody put it. They said I think this was, I've forgotten. They said the office should seek the man rather than the man seeking the office. And I thought that was an interesting way of saying that, that, you know, if a man is seeking the office, we also need to look and see, is the office, which, as we've talked about here, is a noble thing. It's a noble task, and as Shane alluded to earlier, it's a difficult task. It's a grave responsibility. Is that office seeking the man out? Is that seeking your character and your personality to fulfill that?
A couple years ago, I heard a sermon that was called, I think it was titled "Growing Elders" or something like that. And I want to say there was a point made, kind of let me twist this a little bit, where a man may have had great desire, may have not met the qualification of being an elder. And a side point to that was, are we going to be an audience that says, now, qualifications, so you don't. Are we going to meet the qualification, or be the audience that says, let's help you grow
Right.
in these areas that you're lacking in. We want to help you achieve desire.
Yeah, I mean, it's a chicken and egg thing. Are elders born or are they made?
Yeah.
You know, yeah, absolutely. You know, we have to be the kind of church that grows elders, absolutely. And when the church gets in a situation where we say, boy, we're running a little short of qualified men, I think we have to look inwardly at what are we doing to build men that are qualified to serve, and what are we doing to encourage men to desire that office, and as Tara said earlier, and to be the kind of men that can be qualified to serve in that role. Tim is lingering at the bell, and we're out of time. Thank you, guys. We got through 4 of 18 slides, so Wednesday will be frantic. Thank you.